The gunshot echoed across the plains, a sound that changed Vivian Graves' life forever on that blood-soaked evening in 1875. She clutched her husband's lifeless body as the Montana sunset painted the sky crimson, mirroring the stains spreading across his chest, never knowing that the whispers of a curse would follow her like shadows in the coming years. The townsfolk of Redemption Creek called it a robbery gone wrong, but Vivian knew differently. James had been targeted, marked for death by men who feared the railroad would bring change to their profitable isolation. At 26, Vivian found herself a widow with nothing but a small homestead, crushing debts, and the growing suspicion from neighbors that misfortune followed wherever she stepped. First her parents to the fever, then her brother in that mine collapse, now James, they'd whisper behind gloved hands. That woman's got the shadow of death clinging to her skirts. 3 years later, Vivian still felt the sting of those words as she urged her tired mare toward town. The summer heat bore down mercilessly, making the journey from her struggling homestead feel twice as long. Her dark hair was pinned severely beneath a practical bonnet, her once fine dress now faded and mended in multiple places. The small pouch of eggs and the few jars of preserves in her saddlebag were all she had to trade for the supplies she desperately needed. Redemption Creek had grown since the railroad came through, despite the efforts of those who'd murdered James. The main street now boasted a proper hotel alongside the saloon, general store, and small church. As Vivian tethered her horse outside the general store, she steeled herself for the inevitable sideways glances and hushed conversations that would follow her entrance. The bell above the door announced her arrival, and sure enough, the cheerful chatter inside dimmed noticeably. Mrs. Peterson and her daughter immediately moved to the opposite side of the store, while old Mr. Hobbs suddenly found great interest in a shelf of tobacco products. Mrs. Graves, Mr. Finch, the shopkeeper, acknowledged her with a curt nod. "What can I help you with today?" "I've brought eggs and preserves to trade," Vivian said, her voice steady despite the familiar ache in her chest. "I need flour, coffee, and if possible, some lamp oil." Mr. Finch examined her offerings with an exaggerated scrutiny that he never applied to other customers' goods. "Eggs look small this month, and these preserves won't fetch much, I'm afraid." Before Vivian could negotiate, the bell rang again, and the atmosphere in the store shifted palpably. She didn't need to turn to know someone of importance had entered. The way Mr. Finch's demeanor transformed told her everything. "Mr. Porter, welcome back to town. How was your journey to Helena?" Vivian kept her eyes on the counter, not wanting to engage with whoever had commanded such immediate respect. She'd learned that invisibility was her best defense in Redemption Creek. "Productive," came a deep voice behind her. "Got the cattle contract I was after, plus a few other prospects worth pursuing." The voice was unfamiliar, with an accent that suggested he'd spent time in the eastern states. Vivian risked a glance over her shoulder and found herself looking at a tall man with broad shoulders and a face weathered by sun and wind. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and the gun at his hip looked well-maintained rather than decorative. He wasn't from Redemption Creek originally. She would have remembered him, but the way Finch Fawn suggested he was someone of growing importance. "I'll be with you momentarily, sir," Finch said, before turning back to Vivian with renewed impatience. "As I was saying, Mrs. Graves, this isn't enough for what you're asking." "It's the same amount I brought last month," Vivian replied, working to keep the desperation from her voice. "And you gave me all 3 items then. Prices change. Times are hard for everyone." Finch's thin lips pressed together. "I can give you the flour and maybe half the coffee you're wanting." Vivian's stomach nodded. Without the lamp oil, her evenings would be spent in darkness, and half the coffee meant stretching it so thin it would barely color the water. "Please, Mr. Finch. I've been a loyal customer since before your husband got himself killed, bringing trouble down on this town." Finch lowered his voice, but not enough. Some folks are saying that new cattle disease spreading through the Peterson herd started after you sold them that calf last spring. The accusation stung like a physical blow. That's not true. Their bull was sick weeks before they bought my calf. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows a lot of things, Mrs. Graves, Finch replied with cold significance. The stranger porter cleared his throat behind them. Pardon my interruption, but I couldn't help overhearing. Those preserves look mighty fine, madam. Blackberry. Startled, Vivian turned to face him fully. Up close, she noticed his eyes were an unusual shade of gray-blue, like the sky before a storm. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his mid-30s, with streaks of silver at his temples that contrasted with his otherwise dark hair. Yes, she managed. Blackberry and wild plum. Wild plum. His eyebrows rose with genuine interest. Haven't had that since I was a boy in Pennsylvania. I'd be happy to take the lot off your hands at a fair price, of course. Finch looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with this development. Mr. Porter, there's no need to. I insist, Porter interrupted smoothly. In fact, I've been looking to stock my new property's pantry. Mrs. Graves, was it? Perhaps you could advise me on what local provisions might serve me well. The unexpected alliance left Vivian momentarily speechless. She hadn't experienced simple human kindness from a stranger in so long that she hardly knew how to respond. Of course, she finally said. Though Mr. Finch surely knows the local offerings better than I do. I prefer to hear from someone who makes such fine preserves herself. Porter smiled, revealing a small gap between his front teeth that somehow made his handsome face more approachable. Quinn Porter, he introduced himself, extending his hand. Recently arrived from Pennsylvania by way of Colorado. Just purchased the old Thompson Ranch west of town. Vivian hesitated before taking his offered hand. Vivian Graves. Small homestead east of here. His handshake was firm but not overpowering, and he held her gaze without the usual mix of pity and suspicion she'd grown accustomed to. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Graves. The transaction that followed was almost dreamlike in its normalcy. Quinn Porter not only purchased all her preserves at twice what Finch would have offered, but also requested that she consider preparing more for his household, as he was, he explained, a disaster in the kitchen and likely to poison myself without help. When they exited the store together, Vivian with all the supplies she needed and then some, she finally found her voice again. Thank you, Mr. Porter. That was unexpected. Call me Quinn, please. He adjusted his hat against the afternoon sun. And no thanks necessary. Those preserves look worth every cent. Still, you didn't have to intervene. Most folks in town wouldn't. Something flickered across his expression, recognition, perhaps, or understanding. I've found that most folks often lack both courage and sense, Mrs. Graves. Vivian, she corrected, surprising herself. Vivian. He tested the name with a small smile. May I walk you to your horse? I'd like to inquire about commissioning more of those preserves, if you're amenable. As they walked the short distance to where her mare was tethered, Vivian felt the weight of stares from passers-by. Quinn Porter either didn't notice or chose to ignore them, continuing their conversation as if they were old acquaintances simply catching up. The Thompson place needs work, he was saying. But the land's good. Planning to run cattle primarily, but thought I might try my hand at some crops too. You've been here a while, any advice for a newcomer? The genuine question caught her off guard. The winters are harsh, she offered. Worse than Colorado, I'd wager. You'll want to ensure your stock has proper shelter and extra feed stored. Noted. He nodded seriously. And the soil? Good for vegetables, or more suited to grain? It varies. The valley land near the creek grows almost anything. Higher ground is better for wheat and rye. She paused, then added, "If you're serious about crops, there's a natural spring on the north end of the Thompson property that runs even in drought years. Old man Thompson never utilized it properly." Interest sharpened his gaze. "That's valuable information. Thank you." They reached her horse, and an awkward silence fell between them. Vivian wasn't used to conversation that didn't eventually circle back to her perceived bad luck or her husband's violent end. Quinn broke the silence first. "I meant what I said about the preserves. The house is sorely lacking in supplies, and I've got hands coming next week who'll need feeding. If you're willing to sell me more, I'd be grateful." Vivian considered the offer. The extra money would help tremendously, and making preserves was something she could do well. "I could bring some by the Thompson place next week," she suggested cautiously. "That would be ideal." His expression brightened. "Wednesday, perhaps? I'll be getting a delivery of furniture that day, so I'll definitely be around." "Wednesday," she agreed, and was rewarded with another genuine smile that reached his storm-colored eyes. As she mounted her horse, Quinn held the reins steady for her, a simple courtesy that nearly brought tears to her eyes. How long had it been since someone had shown her basic kindness without ulterior motives? "Until Wednesday, then, Vivian," he said, stepping back. "Until Wednesday, Quinn," she replied, and urged her mare forward, feeling strangely lighter than she had in years. Behind her, Quinn Porter watched her ride away, his expression thoughtful. He didn't move until she was nearly out of sight, and he didn't notice Martha Peterson and her daughter whispering urgently as they passed, casting worried glances his way. "Poor man," Martha said loudly enough for him to hear. "Doesn't know what he's getting himself into with that one. It's like inviting a storm into your home." Quinn turned, fixing them with a level gaze that made both women falter. "Ladies," he said with deceptive pleasantness, "where I come from, it's considered poor manners to discuss others in such a fashion." "We meant no disrespect," Martha backpedaled. "It's just, well, there are things about Mrs. Graves that newcomers wouldn't know." "Is that so?" Quinn's tone remained even, but something in his stance changed, becoming more solid, immovable. "In my experience, Mrs. Peterson, people who speak ill of others generally reveal more about themselves than their subjects." With a tip of his hat, he left them standing speechless on the boardwalk, their gossip momentarily silenced by the quiet authority of the newcomer who, unlike most in Redemption Creek, seemed unafraid to form his own opinions. As the sun began its descent toward the distant mountains, both Vivian and Quinn found themselves thinking of Wednesday with a mixture of anticipation and wariness, neither fully understanding that their chance meeting had already set in motion changes that would ripple through their lives and the town of Redemption Creek itself. The days before Wednesday passed with unusual quickness for Vivian. She threw herself into preparing an assortment of preserves, not just the blackberry and wild plum that Quinn had admired, but also strawberry, apricot, and her special apple butter that James had always claimed could make a man forget his own name. The familiar work of washing jars, preparing fruit, and monitoring the bubbling pots kept her hands busy, while her mind wandered repeatedly to the strange encounter in town. Quinn Porter was an enigma. Men of means didn't typically purchase ranches in places like Redemption Creek unless they had connections or history there. And they certainly didn't defend women with reputations like hers in public. Part of her wondered if he was simply unaware of the whispers that followed her, but the conversation with Martha Peterson suggested otherwise. He knew, or at least had heard something, and chose to disregard it. Why? The question nagged at her as she loaded the preserves into her wagon early Wednesday morning. The air held the promise of another scorching day, and she wanted to reach the the Porter Ranch before the worst of the heat descended. The journey took her past familiar landmarks that held memories both sweet and painful. The big oak where she and James had picnicked during their courtship. The bend in the creek where they'd planned to build a water wheel someday. the distant hills where they dreamed of expanding their homestead once the railroad brought prosperity. Dreams that had died with him on that blood-soaked evening. Vivian pushed the thoughts away as the Thompson Ranch came into view. The property had always been impressive, one of the largest in the area, but had fallen into disrepair after Old Man Thompson passed without heirs. Even from a distance, she could see changes. The sagging fence along the main road had been repaired, and smoke rose steadily from the chimney of the main house. Several horses grazed in the near pasture, fine-looking animals that spoke of good breeding and careful selection. As she guided her wagon up the long drive, Vivian noticed more signs of renewal. The barn door that had hung askew for years was now properly mounted. Fresh paint brightened the window frames of the main house, and the choking weeds that had overtaken the front yard had been cleared away, revealing the flagstone path that led to the porch. A tall, lean man Vivian didn't recognize looked up from where he was unloading furniture from a large wagon. He nodded politely as she approached. "Madam," he greeted, pushing back his hat. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see Mr. Porter," Vivian replied, suddenly feeling uncertain. "About some preserves." Recognition flashed in the man's eyes. "You'd be Mrs. Graves, then. Boss mentioned you'd be coming. He's round back with the new windmill parts." "Thank you, Mr. Jackson, madam. Foreman for Mr. Porter." He gestured toward a path that led around the side of the house. "You can take that way. I'd escort you, but these fellas might make off with the good furniture if I don't keep an eye on them." He nodded toward the delivery men, who chuckled good-naturedly at the ribbing. Vivian followed the indicated path, noting more improvements as she went. The side garden, once overgrown and wild, had been partially cleared, though many native plants remained. A new water pump gleamed in the morning sun, and the chicken coop had been rebuilt with fresh lumber. She found Quinn kneeling beside several large metal components, consulting what appeared to be a technical diagram. He was dressed for work in a simple shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and bronzed by the sun. Without his coat and hat, he looked younger, less formal than he had in town. He was so focused on the diagram that he didn't notice her approach until she was almost upon him. When he looked up, surprise gave way to a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Vivian," he said, rising smoothly to his feet. "You made it." "I hope I'm not too early," she replied, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and the wisps of hair that had escaped her bun during the drive. "Not at all. I've been up since dawn wrestling with these contraptions." He gestured to the windmill parts with mock frustration. "The diagram might as well be written in Greek for all the sense I can make of it." The casual admission of difficulty surprised her. Most men she knew would sooner die than admit they couldn't understand something mechanical. "My husband was good with such things," she offered before she could think better of it. "He always said diagrams were for men who wouldn't admit they needed spectacles." Instead of the awkward silence that usually followed any mention of James, Quinn laughed a rich, genuine sound. "Your husband was a wise man. Perhaps I should swallow my pride and fetch my reading glasses." The easy acknowledgement of James, without pity or discomfort, loosened something in Vivian's chest. "I brought the preserves," she said, gesturing back toward her wagon. "More than you probably expected." "Excellent." Quinn's enthusiasm seemed genuine as he wiped his hands on a nearby cloth. "Let me help you unload them. Then perhaps you might take pity on a man who hasn't had a decent meal in days and join me for some coffee? Mrs. Lopez, my housekeeper, who starts next week, sent over some fresh bread yesterday that's begging for those preserves." The invitation was issued so naturally, without hesitation or hidden agenda, that Vivian found herself nodding before she could consider how unusual this situation was, taking refreshments alone with a man she barely knew, at his home, without chaperone or pretense. They walked back to her wagon together, Quinn asking questions about her journey and commenting on the weather with the easy manner of someone accustomed to making conversation. When they reached the wagon, he whistled appreciatively at the array of preserves she'd brought. "You've been busy," he observed, carefully lifting the first crate. "I hope I haven't taken you away from other important work." "This is my work," Vivian replied simply. "Or part of it, at least. The homestead keeps me occupied, but it's good to have something to do with my hands that might bring in extra money." Quinn nodded understanding as they carried the preserves to the house. "My mother was the same way. Always said idle hands were the devil's playground. She could make preserves that would make angels weep. Taught me some of it too, though I never had her touch." The casual mention of his mother, spoken with obvious affection, made Vivian curious about this man's past. But before she could frame a polite question, they reached the house, and Quinn pushed open the door with his shoulder, still balancing the crate of preserves. The interior of the main house was in a state of organized chaos. Furniture in various stages of placement filled the large front room, some still wrapped in protective cloths. Crates of household goods were stacked neatly against one wall, and the scent of fresh paint lingered in the air. Despite the disorder, the space felt welcoming. Large windows allowed sunlight to stream across wooden floors that had been recently polished, and a fire burned cheerfully in the stone hearth despite the summer heat. "Forgive the disarray," Quinn said, setting the crate down on a sturdy table that dominated the dining area. "I'm still getting settled." "It looks like you've made remarkable progress," Vivian observed, placing her own crate beside his. "The Thompson place was nearly derelict last I saw it. It needs work still, but it's sound." Quinn moved toward the kitchen area, where a coffee pot sat on the iron stove. The previous owner may have neglected the aesthetics, but he built this place to last. "Good bones," as my father would say. While Quinn busied himself with the coffee, Vivian took the opportunity to study him more closely. There was an ease to his movements that spoke of physical confidence, but also a precision that suggested careful thought. He wasn't a man who rushed decisions or actions. The gun belt she'd noticed in town was hanging on a peg near the door, within reach but not ostentatiously displayed. "Cream or sugar?" he asked, interrupting her observations. "Just black, thank you," she replied, accepting the steaming cup he offered. The rich aroma immediately reminded her how long it had been since she'd enjoyed properly brewed coffee, not the weak, stretched version she made for herself at home. Quinn retrieved a loaf of bread from a cloth-covered basket and set it on the table along with a knife and 2 plates. "Shall we sample your wares? I've been thinking about that wild plum preserve since we met." The simple act of sharing bread and preserves should not have felt so intimate, but as they sat at the table together, spreading the sweet fruit on fresh bread and discussing the merits of different preservation methods, Vivian felt a strange sense of normalcy she hadn't experienced in years. Quinn asked intelligent questions about her techniques, sharing anecdotes about his mother's cooking and his own disastrous attempts at baking. "These are exceptional," he declared after trying each variety. "Better than any I've had since leaving Pennsylvania. You could sell these for premium prices in Helena or even Denver." Vivian warmed at the praise. "That's kind of you to say, but I have no connections in those markets." "I do," Quinn said simply. "I make regular trips to both for business. If you're interested, I could take samples on my next journey, perhaps arrange for orders." The offer was so unexpected that Vivian nearly dropped her cup. "You would do that? For a near stranger?" Something shifted in Quinn's expression, a softening around the eyes, a slight downward turn of his mouth. "I'd do it because these preserves deserve to be enjoyed by people who would appreciate them. And because everyone deserves a fair chance at prosperity, Vivian." The use of her first name, spoken with such quiet conviction, created a moment of connection that felt almost physical. Vivian looked away first, unsure how to respond to such straightforward kindness. "You're very different from most people in Redemption Creek," she finally said. "I've found that most small towns are similar, quick to judge, slow to forget, and resistant to change." He took a sip of his coffee. "But individuals, now they're a different matter entirely. Some of the finest people I've known lived in the smallest, most narrow-minded communities. And some of the worst," Vivian added softly. Quinn studied her for a moment, his gray-blue eyes thoughtful. "Yes," he agreed, "some of the worst as well." A comfortable silence fell between them as they finished their coffee. Through the window, Vivian could see the men still unloading furniture from the delivery wagon, working with the efficient rhythm of those accustomed to physical labor. "You've hired good men," she observed. "Trying to," Quinn replied. "Jackson, my foreman, came with me from Colorado. The others are local, hired on recommendation. I need about 5 more if I'm going to get this operation running properly before winter. Good help is hard to find around here," Vivian warned. "Most skilled ranch hands left when the mines opened north of here. Better pay, they said. And less exposure to the elements," Quinn added with a wry smile. "I'm offering fair wages and steady work. Word will spread." He paused, then asked with apparent casualness, "Do you manage your homestead alone, Vivian?" The question, though gently posed, brushed against the reality of her daily struggles. "I do what I can. Hire day labor when necessary, though that's become complicated in recent years." "Because of the rumors," Quinn stated rather than asked. Vivian set down her cup, suddenly tense. "So you have heard them? It's a small town." He shrugged one shoulder. "Hard not to hear gossip, whether you want to or not. And yet you're sitting here, sharing a meal with the cursed widow of Redemption Creek." The bitterness she tried to keep contained slipped into her voice. "Most would consider that tempting fate." Quinn's expression remained steady, unflinching in the face of her sharp tone. "I've never put much stock in superstition, Vivian. Life has enough real dangers without inventing mystical ones." "It's not superstition to them," she said quietly. 3 years since James died, and they still cross the street when they see me coming. The mercantile charges me more than others. The church welcomes me only because Reverend Wallace believes in redemption for all, even those he privately considers marked by misfortune. Quinn leaned forward slightly, his gaze intent. "And what do you believe, Vivian? Do you think you're cursed?" The direct question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her that before. They'd simply assumed, whispered, judged. "I believe." She hesitated, searching for words to express what she'd never articulated aloud. "I believe that life is cruelly random sometimes. That good people die while the wicked prosper. That love, no matter how strong, cannot protect those we care for from bullets or disease or accidents." She took a steadying breath. "I don't believe I'm cursed. But I do wonder why I've been left behind each time." The confession hung in the air between them, more revealing than she'd intended. Quinn didn't immediately respond, giving her words the weight of consideration they deserved. "Left behind," he finally echoed. "That's a particular kind of pain, isn't it? To be the one who remains." Something in his tone, a resonance of personal understanding, made Vivian look up sharply. "You speak as though you know." Quinn's gaze shifted to the window, to some middle distance beyond the ranch and present moment. "My wife, Caroline, and our daughter, Emily. Influenza took them both in '67. Emily was just 5. The simple statement, delivered without drama but heavy with contained grief, created an immediate bond of understanding between them. Vivian felt a surge of empathy so strong it was almost physical. "I'm sorry," she said softly, "as am I for your losses." Quinn's eyes returned to hers. "The townsfolk called you cursed. When Caroline and Emily died, They called me haunted. Said the shadows never left my eyes. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. People need explanations for tragedy. It's easier to believe in curses and hauntings than to accept that sorrow strikes without reason or justice. Vivian found herself nodding. It frightens them, the randomness. If it could happen to James, to your family, then it could happen to them, Quinn finished. Better to believe we somehow brought it upon ourselves. The shared understanding created a moment of connection so profound that Vivian felt momentarily breathless. How long had it been since someone truly comprehended the weight she carried? Not just the grief of loss, but the additional burden of others' fear and superstition. The moment was broken by a knock at the door. Jackson poked his head in, looking apologetic. Sorry to interrupt, boss, but the delivery men need signatures before they head back to town. Of course. Quinn rose from the table. Please excuse me for a moment, Vivian. As he stepped outside with Jackson, Vivian took a deep breath, trying to process the unexpected turn their conversation had taken. Quinn Porter wasn't just being kind out of some general sense of decency. He understood, personally and deeply, what it meant to be marked by tragedy in the eyes of others. When Quinn returned a few minutes later, something in his demeanor had shifted slightly, a return to the practical rancher rather than the man who had shared his deepest loss. My apologies for the interruption, he said, resuming his seat. Now, about these preserves. I'd like to purchase all you've brought, and commission more if you're willing. I've got 8 men starting next week who'll need feeding, plus myself and Mrs. Lopez. The return to business gave Vivian a chance to regain her composure. I can certainly provide more. What varieties would you prefer? They spent the next half hour discussing quantities, preferences, and prices. Quinn insisted on paying market rates that were significantly higher than what Finch at the Mercantile would have offered, and he didn't blink when Vivian named her price. There's something else, he said as they concluded their business arrangements. I mentioned needing more hands for the ranch. Jackson tells me you've got experience with cattle. Vivian nodded cautiously. James and I ran a small herd. After he died, I sold most of them, but I kept a few. I can brand, doctor, and help with calving. Would you consider taking on some work here? Not full-time, I understand you've got your own place to manage. But perhaps a few days a week? I could use someone with local knowledge, especially as we head into fall roundup. The offer was so unexpected that Vivian was momentarily speechless. Ranch work was men's work in the eyes of most. Women might help with calving or manage the household aspects of a ranch, but to be hired specifically for cattle work was unusual. I don't understand, she finally managed. You have experienced hands coming. Why would you need me? Quinn leaned back in his chair, regarding her steadily. Because you know this land, these people, the local conditions. Because Jackson says the Peterson boy mentioned you doctor cattle better than most men he knows. And because I suspect you could use the steady income as much as I could use your skills. The blunt practicality of his reasoning was actually more comforting than if he'd couched the offer in charity or pity. The town will talk, she warned. More than they already do. A widow working regularly at a bachelor's ranch. The town will talk regardless, Quinn replied with a dismissive wave. They're talking now, I'd wager, about you bringing preserves here. People who are determined to gossip will find reason to do so whether we give them cause or not. He had a point, Vivian acknowledged silently. Her reputation was already compromised in the eyes of many. And the thought of regular, fairly paid work was desperately appealing. Her savings had dwindled to almost nothing, and the homestead generated barely enough to sustain her, let alone prosper. I would need to be home each evening, she said slowly, testing the idea. I have livestock that requires daily attention. Of course, dawn to dusk, 3 days a week to start. More if you're willing and able as we approach roundup. Quinn named a wage that was fair, not inflated out of pity, but reasonable for skilled labor. When would you want me to start? Monday, if that suits. Quinn's expression brightened, clearly pleased she was considering the offer. We'll be beginning the north pasture fencing. Your knowledge of the property boundaries would be invaluable. As Vivian drove home later that afternoon, her wagon lighter of preserves but her purse heavier with Quinn's payment, she tried to make sense of the day's events. In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from a struggling widow with few prospects to a woman with not one but two potential sources of income and perhaps, more importantly, a connection to someone who understood the peculiar isolation of being marked by tragedy. Quinn Porter was unlike anyone she'd met in Redemption Creek. His straightforward manner and refusal to be swayed by gossip were refreshing, but it was the moment he'd spoken of his wife and daughter that lingered most strongly in her mind. The shadow that had crossed his face, then a grief carried with dignity but never truly vanquished, had created a bridge of understanding between them that transcended their brief acquaintance. She wondered, as her wagon rattled over the familiar road toward home, whether that shared understanding might grow into friendship. It had been so long since she'd had a true friend in Redemption Creek. Most of her former companions had drifted away after James died, uncomfortable with her grief or superstitiously afraid that misfortune might be contagious. The thought of returning to the Porter Ranch on Monday brought an unfamiliar flutter of anticipation to her chest, not romantic in nature, she quickly assured herself, but the simple human pleasure of being valued for her skills rather than judged for her past. As her homestead came into view, modest but well-maintained despite her limited resources, Vivian allowed herself a small, tentative smile. For the first time in 3 years, the future held something more than mere survival. It wasn't hope. Exactly, she'd grown too cautious for that, but perhaps it was hope's quieter cousin. Possibility. The following Monday dawned clear and promising, with just enough crispness in the early morning air to hint at the coming fall. Vivian rose before sunrise, completing her chores with efficient haste. She fed her small collection of animals, 2 milk cows, a half-dozen chickens, her mare, and the sturdy gelding she used for cattle work, and made sure the water troughs were full. Inside the cabin, she packed a simple lunch and dressed in her most practical work clothes. A sturdy split skirt that allowed for riding astride, a cotton shirt beneath a fitted vest, and boots that had once belonged to James, but which she'd modified to fit her smaller feet. The outfit was scandalous by town standards, but practical for ranch work. On her own homestead, there was no one to see or judge her practical clothing choices, and she'd found that most working cowboys cared more about competence than appearance when it came to cattle work. Still, as she rode toward the Porter Ranch, Vivian felt a flutter of nervousness. Would Quinn be shocked by her practical attire? Would the other hands resent working alongside a woman? It had been years since she'd worked a proper ranch operation, and while she was confident in her skills with cattle, the social dynamics of a ranch crew were another matter entirely. The Porter Ranch was already bustling with activity when she arrived. Several men she didn't recognize were gathered near the barn, where Jackson appeared to be giving instructions. The front door of the main house opened as she approached, and Quinn emerged, followed by a plump, middle-aged woman with a severe bun and an apron that looked freshly starched. "Vivian," Quinn called, his face breaking into a genuine smile of welcome. "Right on time. Let me introduce you to Mrs. Lopez, the salvation of my household and already the best cook in 3 counties. The older woman gave a dismissive wave at the praise but smiled warmly at Vivian. "Mr. Porter exaggerates, but I do make a decent biscuit. You must be Mrs. Graves. I've heard good things about your preserves." The friendly greeting, without a hint of the wariness Vivian had come to expect from strangers, was immediately disarming. "Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Lopez. I hope my preserves meet your standards. Better than anything I could put up with these arthritic hands," the housekeeper replied pragmatically. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got bread to start if these men expect to have sandwiches for lunch. With a nod to Quinn, she returned to the house. Quinn turned to Vivian, his eyes taking in her practical attire with approval rather than shock. Ready for a day of fence mending? Jackson's just briefing the men on the north boundary work. Ready as I'll ever be, Vivian replied, dismounting. As they walked toward the gathered ranch hands, Quinn spoke in a lower voice. I should warn you, some of these men are local and might carry preconceptions. Jackson will keep them in line, but if anyone gives you trouble, I can handle a few suspicious cowboys, Vivian assured him, touched by his concern. It's not the first time I've worked with men who thought a woman had no place on a ranch. Quinn nodded, respecting her confidence. Of course. But the offer stands. Any problems, you come to me or Jackson directly. The foreman looked up as they approached, his weathered face breaking into a smile of greeting. Mrs. Graves, good to see you again. Men, this is Mrs. Vivian Graves. She knows this land better than any of us and will be helping with the north boundary work today. Vivian took stock of the assembled cowboys, 6 in total, ranging in age from a boy who couldn't be more than 17 to a grizzled older man with a significant limp. Most nodded politely, though she caught the flicker of recognition and wariness in the eyes of 2 she vaguely recognized from town. Mrs. Graves will be riding with Tucker's team today, Jackson continued, gesturing to a tall, lanky man with the impressive mustache. Tucker, you'll be responsible for the northwest corner where that old fence line meets the creek. The man called Tucker touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Yes, sir. Mrs. Graves, pleased to make your acquaintance. Hope you don't mind getting your hands dirty. I'd be more concerned about keeping up with me, Mr. Tucker, Vivian replied with quiet confidence, drawing a few surprised chuckles from the men. As Jackson continued outlining the day's work, Vivian felt Quinn's presence beside her, solid and reassuring. He didn't hover protectively or make a show of giving her special treatment, but his quiet support was evident in the way he'd integrated her into the work crew without qualification or apology for her gender. The day passed in a blur of physical labor that left Vivian's muscles aching but her mind clearer than it had been in months. Tucker proved to be a respectful team leader, listening to her advice about the tricky terrain near the creek and deferring to her knowledge of the property boundaries. The youngest hand, Ethan, barely 18 and eager to prove himself, watched her with undisguised admiration when she demonstrated the most efficient way to secure fence posts in the rocky soil. By midday, when Mrs. Lopez's son arrived with a wagon bearing lunch for the workers, Vivian had almost forgotten to be concerned about her reception. The physical work, the problem-solving, the satisfaction of seeing tangible progress all reminded her of the life she'd shared with James, but without the crushing weight of grief that usually accompanied such memories. She sat slightly apart from the men during lunch, not out of discomfort but from habit. Years of keeping to herself had made solitude her default state. She was surprised when Quinn approached, his own plate in hand, and sat on the fallen log beside her. Tucker says you're worth any 3 hands when it comes to fence work, he said by way of greeting. Says you've got a knack for finding the path of least resistance across difficult terrain. Vivian felt a flush of pleasure at the praise. My father taught me to read land. Said it was as important as reading books if you wanted to survive out here. Your father was right. Quinn took a bite of his sandwich. Jackson also mentioned you corrected young Ethan's approach to the post holes. Saved him considerable effort, apparently. He was using too much force, not enough leverage, Vivian explained. Common mistake for someone with more strength than experience. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, looking out over the expanse of the ranch. From this vantage point on the northern ridge, the main house and outbuildings were visible in the distance, as was the glittering ribbon of the creek that wound through the property. It's good land, Vivian observed. Old Man Thompson never did it justice. That seems to be the consensus, Quinn agreed. Though I'm finding he wasn't quite as neglectful as appearances suggested. The water systems are surprisingly well planned, and the grazing rotation he used was actually quite sophisticated. He was a strange man, Vivian recalled. Brilliant in some ways, utterly careless in others. James always said Thompson could plan a cattle operation on paper better than anyone, but couldn't be bothered to fix a broken gate. The mention of James came naturally this time, without the usual stab of pain. Quinn seemed to notice his expression warming. "What kind of man was your husband?" he asked quietly. The question was so direct, so genuine in its interest, that Vivian found herself answering without her usual guardedness. "He was determined, had a vision for what our homestead could become and worked tirelessly toward it. Stubborn to a fault, we had some magnificent arguments." A small smile touched her lips at the memory. "But kind, always kind. He could gentle the most skittish colt and charm the sourest shopkeeper. He believed in the railroad bringing prosperity to Redemption Creek, fought for it when others wanted to keep the town isolated." "Is that why he was killed?" Quinn asked, his tone gentle but direct. Vivian tensed slightly, then deliberately relaxed her shoulders. "Yes. There were powerful men who preferred Redemption Creek remain off the main line. Easier to control commerce, charge whatever prices they wanted for goods. James gathered evidence of their schemes, planned to take it to the territorial governor." She swallowed hard. "They called it a robbery gone wrong. No one was ever charged." Quinn's expression darkened. "These men, they're still in town? Some have moved on. Others remain, respected citizens above suspicion." Vivian's voice took on an edge of bitterness. "It's easier for folks to believe I'm cursed than to acknowledge that respected businessmen might be murderers." Quinn was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "Justice can be slow, but it usually finds its way eventually," he finally said. "At least that's what I've found." Something in his tone made Vivian look at him more closely. "You sound like a man who's waited for justice before." "Perhaps." A shadow crossed his face, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "But that's a story for another day." He gestured toward the men, who were beginning to pack up their lunch things. "Duty calls. Will we see you on Wednesday as well?" The change of subject was deliberate, Vivian realized, but she respected his right to his privacy. "Yes, if the offer still stands." "It more than stands. Jackson's already reworking the schedule to make best use of your skills." Quinn rose, offering a hand to help her up, a courtesy, not a presumption of weakness. "Thank you for today, Vivian. Your help is genuinely valuable." As they returned to work, Vivian found herself pondering the brief conversation. Quinn Porter was becoming more intriguing with each interaction, a man of evident means and education who chose to establish himself in a backwater like Redemption Creek, who hired a supposedly cursed widow without hesitation, who spoke of waiting for justice with the quiet certainty of personal experience. The afternoon passed quickly, and by the time the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Vivian felt the particular satisfaction that comes only from physical labor well executed. The north boundary fence was nearly complete, with only a small section near the rocky outcropping left for the next day's work. As she prepared to ride home, Quinn approached, leading his own horse. "I'll ride with you to the crossroads," he said. "Need to check the South Creek crossing before dark." Vivian knew the South Crossing was in the opposite direction from the path to her homestead, but she didn't comment on the transparent excuse to accompany her part of the way home. The gesture was protective without being patronizing, and after years of making her way alone, she found she didn't mind the company. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional call of a bird the only interruptions to the peaceful early evening. The air was turning golden with the approach of sunset, casting long shadows across the rolling landscape. "Will you tell me something, Vivian?" Quinn asked as they approached the crossroads where their paths would diverge. "If I can," she replied cautiously. "Why did you stay in Redemption Creek after James died? After the town turned against you, why remain where you're continually reminded of both your loss and their cruelty?" The question was posed without judgment, simple curiosity evident in his tone. Vivian considered it carefully, realizing she'd never fully articulated her reasons even to herself. At first it was shock, I suppose. Grief makes decisions impossible. She adjusted her reins slightly. Then it was determination. I wouldn't be driven from the home James and I built together. Later, practicality. Where would I go? With limited funds and no connections elsewhere. She paused, then added more quietly, "And perhaps a kind of penance." Penance. Quinn's eyebrows drew together. For what sin? For surviving. The admission came more easily than she expected. For not somehow preventing what happened to James. For being the one left behind, as you put it. Quinn's expression softened with understanding. The survivor's burden. I know it well. Is that why you left Pennsylvania after your wife and daughter died? Vivian asked, realizing as the words left her mouth that she was assuming rather than knowing. Partly, Quinn acknowledged, though there were other factors. He was quiet for a moment, then added, "Sometimes a place holds too many ghosts to allow for healing, and sometimes the ghosts themselves demand action that can't be taken where they were created." The cryptic statement raised more questions than it answered, but they had reached the crossroads, and Quinn reined his horse to a stop. "Thank you again for today," he said, his tone shifting to something more professional. "Wednesday at the same time?" "I'll be there," Vivian promised. "Though I should warn you, I saw signs of a storm building from the northwest. If it continues, we may have rain by tomorrow evening." Quinn glanced toward the distant horizon, where indeed the faintest darkening was visible. "Your weather sense appears to be as sharp as your cattle knowledge. We'll plan accordingly." He tipped his hat. "Safe journey home, Vivian." As she watched him turn his horse toward the south crossing, Vivian felt a strange mixture of emotion, satisfaction from the day's work, appreciation for the respect she'd been shown, and a growing curiosity about the man who had so unexpectedly entered her life. Quinn Porter was a puzzle with many missing pieces, but for the first time in years, Vivian found herself genuinely interested in understanding another person. The storm Vivian had predicted arrived with dramatic force the following evening, lashing Redemption Creek and the surrounding countryside with driving rain and spectacular lightning. She spent a worried night securing her small barn and comforting her agitated livestock, grateful that at least she wouldn't be expected at the Porter Ranch until the following day, assuming the weather cleared. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind flooded creeks, muddy roads, and a crystalline clarity to the air that made the distant mountains seem close enough to touch. Vivian surveyed the damage to her property a few fence posts down, the vegetable garden somewhat battered but salvageable, the roof of the chicken coop leaking but structurally sound. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach instinctively for the rifle she kept by the door, but she relaxed when she recognized Jackson's distinctive silhouette. The foreman reined in his horse at a respectful distance and called out a greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Graves. Boss sent me to check if you weathered the storm all right." "Got some significant damage at the Ranch Creek, overflowed its banks and took out part of the south fence line." "I'm fine, Mr. Jackson," she called back. "Some minor repairs needed, but nothing urgent." He dismounted and approached, removing his hat. "Boss also wanted me to let you know we'll be focusing on storm repairs today and tomorrow, if you're still able to come. Different work than planned, but your help would be welcome all the same." The consideration touched Vivian. Quinn could have simply assumed she'd come and help with whatever needed doing, but instead he'd sent Jackson to check on her welfare and give her the option to adjust their arrangement. "I'll be there," she assured him. "Just need to finish securing the chicken coop first." Jackson nodded approvingly. "Need a hand? Boss gave me leave to help if you needed it." Again, the thoughtfulness of the gesture caught her off guard. "That's very kind, but I can manage. It's just a few loose boards that need renailing." "Well, if you're sure." Jackson replaced his hat. "We'll expect you when you can make it. No rush, the creek's still running high, so we're waiting for it to subside before tackling the worst of the fence damage." After Jackson departed, Vivian worked quickly to complete her repairs, her mind on the challenges awaiting at the Porter Ranch. Flood damage could be treacherous, unstable ground, debris carried downstream, the danger of quicksand in certain areas. But there was also something appealing about the clean slate that came after a storm, the opportunity to rebuild stronger than before. When she arrived at the ranch a few hours later, the scene was one of organized activity. Men worked in teams clearing debris, salvaging lumber, and assessing damage. Quinn was in the thick of it, his shirt soaked with sweat as he and two other men wrestled a large tree branch that had crashed through part of the corral fence. He straightened when he saw her approach, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "Vivian, glad to see you made it safely. Jackson said your place escaped the worst of it." "Fortunately, yes. You weren't so lucky, it seems." Quinn grimaced. "The creek rose faster than we anticipated. Lost about 50 yards of fencing on the south boundary, and the bridge to the east pasture is gone. But no livestock casualties, and all the men are safe, so I'm counting our blessings." His practical positivity in the face of significant property damage was admirable. Vivian dismounted, already assessing where she might be most useful. "The South Creek can be treacherous after storms," she warned. "There's a section about a quarter-mile downstream that forms quicksand pockets when it floods." Quinn's eyebrows rose with interest. "That's valuable information. Jackson's sending a team down to assess the full extent of the damage. Perhaps you could accompany them? Your knowledge of the land could prevent accidents." The request made perfect sense, but Vivian hesitated. "Are you sure? I'm equally capable of helping with the physical repairs here." "I've no doubt of your capabilities," Quinn replied easily. "But knowledge of dangerous terrain is more valuable than another pair of hands lifting debris. Lives before property, always." The sentiment expressed so matter-of-factly, as if it were the most obvious priority in the world, resonated with Vivian. James had held similar values, always putting the safety of people above material concerns, a perspective not universally shared in the often brutal economics of frontier ranching. "Of course," she agreed. "I'll join Jackson's team." The morning passed swiftly as Vivian guided the damage assessment team along the creek, pointing out areas of concern and helping map the extent of the destruction. The men, including two she recognized from town who had previously avoided her in public, listened attentively to her warnings and followed her guidance without question. In the practical context of potential danger, superstitious fears about her curse seemed to fade into irrelevance. By midday, they had compiled a comprehensive assessment of the damage and begun planning the necessary repairs. When they returned to the main ranch for lunch, Vivian was surprised to find Quinn waiting with evident concern. "Everything all right?" he asked as they dismounted. "You were gone longer than expected. The damage extends farther than we initially thought," Jackson explained. "About half a mile of fencing completely washed away, and there's a new channel forming that could cause problems with the eastern water access." Quinn frowned. "That sounds potentially serious." "It is," Vivian confirmed, "but not irreparable. The new channel might actually be an opportunity if directed properly. It could provide water access to the northeast pasture that's always been too dry for good grazing." Quinn's expression shifted from concern to interest. You're suggesting we work with the change rather than fight it? Nature usually wins when you fight her directly, Vivian replied. My father always said it's better to redirect than resist. A slow smile spread across Quinn's face. Your father was a wise man. Let's discuss this further over lunch. I'd like to hear your thoughts on how we might turn this setback into an advantage. The meal that followed was unlike any Vivian had experienced in years. Seated at the large kitchen table with Quinn, Jackson, and several of the senior hands, she found herself actively participating in planning discussions, her suggestions not merely tolerated but actively sought. Quinn repeatedly drew her into the conversation, asking pointed questions about her experiences with previous floods and her knowledge of the property's natural water patterns. If we divert the new channel here, she explained, marking a spot on the rough map Jackson had sketched, and reinforce this section, we could create a reliable water source for at least 20 acres of currently underutilized grazing land. Quinn studied the map thoughtfully. The investment in additional lumber and labor would be substantial. Would the improved grazing be worth it? In a normal year, perhaps not immediately, Vivian acknowledged. But we're heading into what looks to be a dry fall. Having additional well-watered grazing land could mean the difference between buying supplemental feed or not. She's right about the dry fall coming. One of the older hands volunteered. Caterpillars have been thicker than usual, and the squirrels started gathering nuts 3 weeks early. Always means a dry spell ahead. Quinn looked between Vivian and the old hand with evident interest. Local knowledge that can't be found in any book, he remarked. This is precisely why I wanted your input, Vivian. The conversation continued through lunch and into the early afternoon, evolving from immediate repair priorities to longer-term improvements that could make the ranch more resilient to future storms. Throughout, Quinn treated Vivian's contributions with the same serious consideration he gave Jackson's, creating an atmosphere of collaborative problem-solving that energized her in unexpected ways. As the men returned to their work, Quinn invited Vivian to ride with him to inspect the proposed diversion site for the new creek channel. They traveled in companionable silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts as they followed the swollen creek downstream. You're very good at this, Quinn observed eventually. Strategic thinking, balancing immediate needs against long-term benefits. It's a rare quality. Vivian felt a flush of pleasure at the genuine compliment. James and I used to spend evenings planning improvements for our homestead. He had the vision, I had the practical sense of what was feasible. Between us, we made good decisions. You still do, Quinn said simply. Make good decisions, I mean. Running that homestead alone for 3 years in the face of the town's superstitious nonsense that takes remarkable strength and judgment. The direct praise, offered without qualification or pity, touched something deep within Vivian. For so long, her continued survival had been viewed by others as either stubborn foolishness or evidence of her supposed curse. To have it recognized as an achievement requiring strength and good judgment was unexpectedly validating. Thank you, she said quietly, though there have been times I've questioned my decision to stay. Quinn nodded understanding. We all question our paths. The important thing is making the choice for your own reasons, not because of others' expectations or fears. They reached the proposed diversion point and dismounted to examine the terrain more closely. The recent flood had carved a new channel that veered eastward from the main creek, creating what could become, with proper reinforcement, a sustainable water source for the dry northeastern pastures. As they walked the perimeter of the new channel, Vivian found herself sharing ideas freely, pointing out where strategic reinforcement would be needed and where the natural contours of the land could be utilized to maximum advantage. Quinn listened attentively, asking insightful questions and occasionally suggesting modifications that reflected his own considerable knowledge of water management. The collaborative problem-solving was exhilarating in a way Vivian hadn't experienced since James died. There was an ease to working with Quinn that reminded her of the partnership she'd once shared with her husband, but with differences that made it distinctly new rather than a painful echo of the past. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation drifted from practical ranch matters to more personal topics. Quinn spoke of his experiences ranching in Colorado, the challenges and successes he'd encountered there. Vivian shared stories of her childhood on her father's small farm in Nebraska, and how she'd come to Montana as a young bride full of dreams and determination. "What made you choose Redemption Creek?" she asked as they remounted their horses for the return journey. "It's hardly the center of the cattle industry." Quinn was silent for a moment, his expression thoughtful. "Several factors," he finally said. "The land was good and undervalued. The railroad connection makes transportation relatively efficient. And—" he hesitated, then continued with careful neutrality. "I had reason to believe Redemption Creek might benefit from new investment and leadership." Something in his tone suggested there was more to the story than he was sharing, but Vivian didn't press. Everyone had their secrets, their private motivations. She, of all people, understood the need for privacy. As they approached the main ranch buildings, Quinn reined his horse to a stop, turning to face her. "I have a proposition for you, Vivian. One I hope you'll consider carefully." The sudden formality in his tone made her wary. "What kind of proposition?" "A business partnership of sorts." Quinn's expression was earnest. "Your knowledge of this land, of local conditions and natural patterns, is invaluable. I'd like to engage you as a formal consultant for the ranch, not just occasional labor, but a regular advisor with profit participation." Vivian stared at him in shock. "Profit participation? You hardly know me." "I know enough," Quinn replied steadily. "I know you're intelligent, observant, and practical. I know you understand this land in ways I never could without years of experience. And I know that your input today alone may have saved me thousands in potential losses and created opportunities one wouldn't have recognized." The offer was so unexpected, so generous, that Vivian's instinctive reaction was suspicion. The town would never accept such an arrangement. A widow in business partnership with a bachelor. The town's opinion is irrelevant to good business decisions. Quinn interrupted firmly. "I'm not proposing anything improper. This would be a formal business arrangement with contracts and clear boundaries. Mrs. Lopez would continue as housekeeper and chaperone when you're here, and all our business could be conducted in full view of the ranch hands if necessary." His evident frustration with the town's potential reaction was oddly reassuring. He had considered the social implications, but dismissed them as secondary to the practical benefits of their partnership. "I need time to consider," Vivian said finally. "It's a generous offer, but a significant change from what I've been doing." Quinn nodded immediately. "Of course. Take all the time you need to think it through. The offer remains open." He hesitated, then added, "Whatever you decide, I hope you'll continue working here in some capacity. Your presence has already made a positive difference." As they parted ways at the end of the day, Vivian's mind was awash with conflicting thoughts and emotions. Quinn's offer represented financial security she hadn't dared hope for since James died. It would allow her to use her knowledge and skills in meaningful ways, to be valued for her contributions rather than feared for her supposed curse. Yet it also meant deeper involvement with Quinn Porter, a man who intrigued and unsettled her in equal measure. A man who, despite his apparent openness, clearly harbored secrets of his own. A man whose presence in her life was already causing her to question the careful isolation she'd built around herself since James's death. As she rode home through the golden evening light, Vivian realized with a start that she was experiencing something she'd almost forgotten: the sensation of looking forward to tomorrow, of having something to anticipate rather than merely endure. Whether that something was the work itself or the company of the man who had offered it, she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely. The weeks that followed brought significant changes to Vivian's life. After careful consideration, she accepted Quinn's offer of a consulting partnership, though with certain modifications that maintained her independence while formalizing her role at the ranch. 3 days each week, she worked directly with Quinn and Jackson on various aspects of the ranch operations, from water management to cattle health to grazing rotation. The other days, she tended her own homestead and continued producing preserves, which now found eager markets in Helena and Denver thanks to Quinn's business connections. As September gave way to October, Vivian found herself more financially secure than she'd been since James died. The consulting fees from the Porter Ranch, combined with the growing success of her preserves business, allowed her to hire occasional help for her homestead and make long-neglected repairs to her cabin. More surprising than the financial improvement, however, was the gradual shift in how some of the townsfolk treated her. Not everyone, certainly Mrs. Peterson and her circle, remained convinced of Vivian's cursed nature, but others began to thaw as word spread of her successful partnership with Quinn Porter. The shopkeeper at the mercantile no longer overcharged her for basic supplies. The blacksmith, who had previously refused to shoe her horse without payment in advance, now greeted her with a respectful nod when she passed his shop. "It's remarkable what financial success can do to cure superstition," Quinn observed dryly one afternoon as they rode back from inspecting the newly completed water diversion project. "Suddenly your supposed curse seems less contagious." Vivian laughed, a genuine sound that still surprised her when it emerged. "Money speaks louder than fear, apparently, though not everyone's convinced. Mrs. Peterson still crosses the street when she sees me coming." "Mrs. Peterson," Quinn replied with evident distaste, "is a woman whose opinion should concern no one with sense." Something in his tone, a personal edge beneath the general contempt, caught Vivian's attention. "You sound as though you have specific reason to dislike her." Quinn's expression tightened momentarily. "Let's just say I've heard enough of her vicious gossip to form a low opinion of her character." Before Vivian could inquire further, they crested a hill that afforded a spectacular view of the ranch spread out below them, the main house and outbuildings now fully repaired after the storm damage, the grazing cattle scattered across the lush pastures, the new water channel glinting in the afternoon sun as it carried life-giving moisture to previously underutilized land. "It's coming together well," Vivian observed, genuinely impressed by the transformation of the once neglected property. "Thanks in no small part to you." Quinn's gaze swept over the landscape with evident satisfaction before returning to her face. "I have something to show you, if you've time before heading home." Curiosity piqued, Vivian nodded. "Of course." Quinn led her toward a section of the property she hadn't visited in recent weeks, a sheltered valley not far from the main house that had been overgrown with brush when he first purchased the ranch. As they approached, Vivian realized the area had been cleared and fenced, with several neat rows of freshly turned earth visible within the enclosure. "An orchard," she guessed, noting the regular spacing of what appeared to be newly planted saplings. "Apple, cherry, and plum," Quinn confirmed, a hint of boyish enthusiasm breaking through his usual composed demeanor. 20 trees to start, with room for 20 more next spring if these take well." Vivian dismounted to examine the setup more closely, impressed by the thoughtful layout. "You've positioned them to get maximum sun while using the hillside as a windbreak. Smart. I had good advice." Quinn joined her at the fence, his expression warming as he watched her inspect his work. "Remember that conversation we had about your wild plum preserves? You mentioned that the local soil would support fruit trees with proper drainage and protection from the worst winter winds." The fact that he had not only remembered that casual conversation but acted on her suggestion touched Vivian deeply. "I didn't think you were really listening to my rambling about soil conditions." "I listen to everything you say, Vivian," Quinn replied with a simple directness that made her heart skip. "You haven't shared a single observation that wasn't worth hearing." The compliment, delivered without flourish but with evident sincerity, created a moment of connection between them that transcended their business partnership. For a breathless instant, Vivian was acutely aware of Quinn as a man, the solid strength of his presence beside her, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him, the gentle intelligence in his storm-colored eyes. Flustered by her own reaction, she turned back to the orchard. These will take years to produce significant fruit. Some things are worth waiting for, Quinn said quietly. And in the meantime, the journey itself has value. The philosophical observation seemed to carry meaning beyond mere fruit trees. But before Vivian could respond, Quinn continued in a more practical tone. I've ordered grafting stock for next spring. Thought we might experiment with some of the wild plum varieties you've mentioned. See if we can develop something unique to this property. The "we" didn't escape Vivian's notice, the casual assumption of continued collaboration, of shared future plans. It was both comforting and unsettling how easily Quinn had begun to include her in his vision for the ranch's future. As they remounted their horses and headed back toward the main house, Vivian found herself contemplating this subtle shift in their relationship. What had begun as a straightforward business arrangement had evolved into something more complex, a partnership based on mutual respect and shared purpose that occasionally hinted at the potential for deeper connection. Quinn, for his part, seemed content to let their relationship develop at its own pace. He never pressed for more personal disclosure than she offered freely, never crossed the boundaries of propriety that separated their professional collaboration from potential courtship. Yet there were moments like his comment about listening to everything she said that suggested his interest might extend beyond her practical knowledge of ranching. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. After James's death, Vivian had resigned herself to a life alone, convinced that fate had determined she would lose anyone she dared to love. The possibility of opening herself to such vulnerability again seemed foolhardy at best, potentially disastrous at worst. Yet as October's brilliant colors gave way to November's more somber palette, Vivian found herself increasingly drawn to Quinn's company, looking forward to their workdays together with an anticipation that went beyond professional satisfaction. Their conversations ranged from practical ranch matters to books they'd read, childhood memories, and philosophical perspectives on life at the frontier's edge. In Quinn, she found an intellect that challenged and complemented her own, a perspective that broadened her thinking without dismissing her viewpoints. Most compelling of all was his evident respect for her resilience. Unlike others who viewed her continued survival after multiple losses as either pitiable or suspicious, Quinn seemed to genuinely admire her strength. He neither treated her as fragile nor expected her to be unnaturally stoic, a balance that allowed her, gradually, to lower some of the defensive walls she'd built around her heart. As winter approached, bringing with it the prospect of reduced work at the ranch due to weather constraints, Vivian found herself dreading the return to isolation that the season typically imposed. Her homestead, while secure enough against Montana's brutal winters, offered little beyond physical shelter during the long, dark months when travel became difficult and social calls non-existent. Quinn seemed to sense her unspoken concern. One crisp November afternoon, as they finished their work earlier than usual due to the rapidly shortening daylight, he broached a subject that clearly had been on his mind. "I've been thinking about the winter arrangements," he began as they walked their horses toward the barn. The usual pattern would be to reduce operations until spring, keep only essential hands-on through the worst months. Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. The practical reality of ranch life that winter meant reduced work and income was nothing new, but the prospect of losing her regular connection to Quinn and the life at his ranch felt unexpectedly painful. "However," Quinn continued, "I have some different ideas for this winter. With the new barn complete and the additional hay storage we've built, we're positioned to attempt winter feeding protocols I saw implemented successfully in Colorado. It would mean continuing regular operations, weather permitting, with perhaps 2 days a week instead of 3 during the deepest winter months." Hope flared in Vivian's chest, though she kept her expression neutral. That sounds sensible, if the weather cooperates. There's more, Quinn added, his tone carefully casual. Mrs. Lopez mentioned that the journey between your homestead and the ranch could become treacherous during winter storms. She suggested, and I concur, that it might be prudent to offer you use of the foreman's cabin during your workdays, particularly if weather threatens to worsen while you're here. The foreman's cabin, a small but sturdy structure near the main house that currently stood empty since Jackson preferred to bunk with the other hands, would indeed provide a practical solution to the potential dangers of winter travel. But it also represented a significant change in their arrangement, one that might raise eyebrows in town despite its practical justification. That's very considerate, Vivian said cautiously, though I wouldn't want to create any impressions that might damage your standing in the community. Quinn's expression hardened slightly. My standing in the community is secure enough to withstand gossip, Vivian. And those whose opinions I actually value would understand the practical necessity of ensuring your safety. The implicit prioritization of her welfare over social convention touched Vivian deeply. Thank you. I'll consider it, should the weather make it necessary. Quinn nodded, seemingly satisfied with her cautious acceptance. There's one other matter I wanted to discuss. Thanksgiving is approaching, and Mrs. Lopez is planning quite a feast for the ranch hands. We would be honored if you would join us. The invitation, though extended with apparent casualness, carried emotional weight that both recognized. Thanksgiving was a family holiday, a time when the lines between business relationships and personal connections traditionally blurred. Accepting would signal a willingness to cross from the purely professional into something more communal, more intimate in its own way. I would like that, Vivian heard herself say, surprising herself with the lack of hesitation. Thank you. The smile that transformed Quinn's face, genuine pleasure untempered by his usual reserve, made something warm unfurl in Vivian's chest. Excellent. Mrs. Lopez will be delighted. She's been not so subtly suggesting that the table needs a feminine touch beyond her own practical arrangements. As they parted ways that evening, Vivian felt a curious lightness despite the increasing chill in the air. The winter ahead, rather than looming as a period of isolation and mere survival, now held possibilities for continued connection and even celebration. For the first time since James's death, she found herself looking forward to a holiday, imagining herself as part of a gathering rather than enduring the day alone with memories and regrets for company. It was a small shift in perspective, perhaps, but it represented a crack in the protective shell she'd built around her heart, a willingness to consider that perhaps her future might hold more than solitary endurance. As she rode home through the gathering dusk, Vivian allowed herself to acknowledge what she had been avoiding for weeks. Her feelings for Quinn Porter had grown beyond professional respect or even friendship. There was a tenderness there, a yearning for connection that both frightened and exhilarated her. Whether he shared those feelings remained unclear. His kindness and consideration might simply reflect his natural character rather than any particular attachment to her. But for the first time in 3 years, Vivian found herself willing to consider the possibility of opening her heart again, of risking the vulnerability that came with caring deeply for another person. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift lazily from the darkening sky, she felt something that had been absent from her life for too long. Hope, fragile but persistent, like a tiny flame sheltered against the coming winter winds. Thanksgiving at the Porter Ranch exceeded all of Vivian's expectations. Mrs. Lopez had transformed the dining room into a harvest celebration, with golden leaves and late-blooming wildflowers arranged in simple pottery vases, and candles casting a warm glow over the polished table. The meal itself was magnificent, a roast turkey with all the traditional accompaniments, plus several Mexican dishes that reflected Mrs. Lopez's heritage. What truly made the day special, however, was the atmosphere. Quinn had invited not just his regular hands but also several families from outlying homesteads who might otherwise have spent the holiday alone. The resulting gathering was diverse and lively, weathered cowboys sharing space with farmers' children. A young widow from the North Ridge finding common ground with Mrs. Lopez over recipes. The elderly blacksmith from town contributing stories of Thanksgivings from decades past. In this eclectic assembly, Vivian found herself not isolated or merely tolerated, but welcomed. Quinn had seated her at his right hand, a position of honor that signaled her importance to the ranch operation, while Mrs. Lopez, from her place at the opposite end of the table, offered approving smiles that suggested the older woman saw possibilities beyond mere business partnership. "I haven't seen a spread like this since before the war," the blacksmith, Mr. Holloway, commented as platters were passed. "You've brought something special to Redemption Creek, Mr. Porter." "The credit belongs to Mrs. Lopez," Quinn replied with genuine modesty, "and to all of you who've contributed to making this ranch a success. A man is only as good as the people who work alongside him." His gaze lingered briefly on Vivian as he spoke, a warm acknowledgement of her particular contributions that made her cheeks flush slightly. The conversation flowed easily throughout the meal, touching on everything from cattle prices to recipes, childhood memories to hopes for the coming year. Quinn guided the discussion with the natural ease of a born host, drawing out the shyer guests while gently redirecting those inclined to dominate the conversation. After the meal, while the men retired to the porch for pipes and conversation despite the chill, Vivian found herself helping Mrs. Lopez organize leftovers in the kitchen. The housekeeper hummed contentedly as she worked, occasionally casting knowing glances Vivian's way. "Mr. Porter has changed since you started working here," Mrs. Lopez observed casually as she packed turkey slices into a stoneware container. "He smiles more, makes plans that reach further into the future." Vivian concentrated on the pie she was wrapping, unsure how to respond to the implied connection between her presence and Quinn's improved outlook. "The ranch is doing well. That would make anyone optimistic about the future." Mrs. Lopez made a soft sound that might have been amusement. "The ranch was doing well before you came, Mrs. Graves. But Mr. Porter was, how do I say it, going through the motions, building something without joy in the building." She sealed the container with a decisive motion. "Now there is purpose in his step, light in his eyes." The observation, delivered with the confident wisdom of a woman who had seen much of life, stirred both hope and anxiety in Vivian's chest. "Mrs. Lopez, I wouldn't want you to misinterpret our professional relationship." "Bah!" The older woman waved away her protest. "I have been watching men and women circle each other for 40 years, Mrs. Graves. I know the difference between business and something more." Her expression softened. "And I know that both of you have seen great sorrow. Perhaps that is why you recognize something in each other that the rest of us cannot see." Before Vivian could formulate a response, the kitchen door opened and Quinn himself entered, bringing with him a gust of cold air and the scent of pipe smoke. "The men are debating whether we'll have snow by Christmas," he announced cheerfully. "Holloway swears his niece says yes, while Jackson's betting on a dry December." "And what does Mr. Porter think?" Mrs. Lopez asked, smoothly shifting from personal confidant to efficient housekeeper. "Mr. Porter thinks that nature will do as she pleases regardless of our predictions," Quinn replied with a smile, his gaze moving to Vivian. "Though I've learned to respect local knowledge over scientific forecasts this past season." The compliment warmed Vivian as surely as the kitchen's heat. "The signs point to a snowy December," she offered. "The juniper berries are plentiful, and the geese flew south early this year." Quinn nodded seriously, accepting her weather lore without question. "Then we'll prepare accordingly. Jackson won't be pleased," he wagered quite confidently against Holloway's aching knee. As the afternoon progressed into evening, Guests gradually departed, expressing genuine thanks for the hospitality and carrying packages of leftovers Mrs. Lopez insisted on distributing. Soon only the regular ranch hands remained, gathered in the bunkhouse for their own continued celebration, leaving Quinn, Vivian, and Mrs. Lopez in the main house. Stay a while longer? Quinn invited as Vivian began to gather her things for the ride home. The light's fading, but we've still got an hour before dark. I'd value your opinion on some books I've acquired on local plant species. The request was transparent in its purpose, extending their time together, but offered with such genuine interest that Vivian found herself agreeing easily. Mrs. Lopez, with the practiced discretion of an experienced chaperone, settled herself in a corner of the parlor with her mending, present enough to satisfy propriety but positioned to allow conversation without hovering oversight. The books proved genuinely interesting illustrated volumes on native Montana plants and their uses, including several species Vivian had encountered but never known the proper names for. As they pored over the detailed drawings together, their heads bent close over the pages, Vivian was acutely aware of Quinn's proximity, the warmth radiating from his body, the clean scent of his freshly laundered shirt, the careful way he turned the delicate pages. "This one grows near your creek," she noted, pointing to an illustration of a flowering plant with delicate purple blossoms. "My father called it Heal All. Said it could be made into a poultice for wounds." Prunella vulgaris, Quinn read from the text. Native to North America and Europe. Known for anti-inflammatory properties. He glanced at her with genuine interest. "Your father taught you about medicinal plants?" "My mother, actually," Vivian corrected. She was half Cheyenne. "Learned from her mother, who was a healer for her people before marrying my grandfather." It was a piece of personal history she rarely shared, aware that mixed heritage could be viewed with suspicion or prejudice in many communities. But Quinn's expression showed only respectful interest. "That explains your remarkable understanding of the land," he observed. "Not just knowledge, but a deeper connection to how things work together." The validation of this part of her heritage, so often dismissed or ignored by others, touched Vivian deeply. "My mother believed that everything in nature has purpose and placement, that human work should enhance natural patterns, not fight against them. A wisdom modern science is only beginning to understand," Quinn replied thoughtfully. "In Pennsylvania, I watched farmers battle the land year after year, forcing crops that weren't suited to the soil or climate. Here, working with what the land offers naturally seems to yield better results with less struggle." Their conversation drifted from botany to agricultural philosophy, then to childhood memories and formative experiences. As dusk deepened outside the windows, Vivian realized with a start how comfortable she had become in Quinn's presence, how easily she shared thoughts and perspectives she had kept private for years. "I should go," she said reluctantly, noting the gathering darkness. "The moon is nearly full, plenty of light for the ride home." Quinn nodded, though his expression suggested he was equally reluctant to end their time together. "Of course. Let me saddle your horse while you gather your things." As he rose to do so, a gust of wind rattled the windows, and Mrs. Lopez looked up from her mending with a frown. "That sounds like the start of a proper storm, Mr. Porter. Perhaps Mrs. Graves should consider using the foreman's cabin tonight." The suggestion, though practical given the weather signs, created a moment of tension. Staying overnight at the ranch, even in a separate cabin with Mrs. Lopez as chaperone, would represent a significant deviation from the careful boundaries they had established. Quinn looked to Vivian, his expression carefully neutral. "The choice is entirely yours. The cabin is prepared with fresh linens, as we discussed might be necessary during winter weather. But if you'd prefer to ride home, I'd insist on accompanying you at least part of the way." The decision should have been difficult, fraught with considerations of propriety and potential gossip. Yet as another, stronger gust shook the house, Vivian found herself responding with unexpected certainty. Thank you. I think staying would be the sensible choice, if it's truly no imposition. The relief in Quinn's eyes was quickly masked by practical considerations. No imposition at all. Mrs. Lopez, would you be kind enough to show Mrs. Graves to the cabin and ensure she has everything she needs? I'll check on the livestock and make sure everything is secured for the night. The foreman's cabin, when Mrs. Lopez led her to it shortly thereafter, proved to be a cozy, well-maintained structure with a small parlor, bedroom, and wash area. A fire had been laid in the stone fireplace, ready for lighting, and the simple furniture was clean and serviceable. Mr. Porter had this prepared weeks ago, Mrs. Lopez commented as she lit the fire with practiced efficiency. Said it was important to have a proper place for you if weather made travel unsafe. She straightened, giving Vivian an appraising look. He is a man who thinks ahead, Mrs. Graves, who prepares for possibilities. The observation seemed loaded with meaning beyond the immediate circumstances. Before Vivian could respond, Mrs. Lopez continued briskly. There are night clothes in the chest, new, never worn, and a robe. Mr. Porter ordered them from Denver along with linens and such. Said a lady should have proper accommodations if she found herself weatherbound here. The thoughtfulness of the preparation, not just basic necessities, but details that would ensure her comfort and dignity, touched Vivian deeply. It spoke of consideration that went beyond mere professional courtesy or even friendship. Mrs. Lopez, she began hesitantly. You've known Mr. Porter longer than I have. Is he always so attentive to details? The housekeeper's expression softened. He is a thorough man in all things, yes, but this, she gestured to the carefully prepared cabin. This is special attention, Mrs. Graves, the kind a man gives when he cares deeply about a woman's comfort and reputation. The confirmation of what Vivian had begun to suspect, that Quinn's feelings might indeed extend beyond professional respect, created a flutter of both excitement and apprehension in her chest. Before she could pursue the conversation further, however, a knock at the door announced Quinn's arrival, his arms laden with additional firewood. Storm's definitely coming in, he reported as Mrs. Lopez admitted him. Barometer's falling, and the clouds are moving in from the northwest, just as you predicted, Vivian. He stacked the wood neatly beside the fireplace. This should keep you warm through the night, and Mrs. Lopez has promised to bring over breakfast in the morning. You're very kind, Vivian said, feeling suddenly shy in this more domestic setting. Both of you. It's no trouble, Quinn assured her. Your safety and comfort are important too to the ranch. The slight correction, the momentary hesitation before he shifted from personal to professional framing, was not lost on either woman. Mrs. Lopez, with the impeccable timing of an experienced social navigator, announced that she needed to return to the main house to prepare for morning. I'll leave you to settle in, Mrs. Graves. Mr. Porter can answer any other questions you might have about the cabin. As the door closed behind the housekeeper, a moment of awkward silence fell between Vivian and Quinn. They were alone together for the first time in circumstances that weren't strictly business-related, and both seemed acutely aware of the shift in context. Quinn broke the tension first, moving toward the small table where a lamp provided warm, golden light. I brought something I thought might interest you, he said, reaching into his coat pocket and withdrawing a small, worn book. Found it in Helena last time I was there, a journal by a woman who traveled with her husband to Montana in the 1850s. Her observations on local plants and their uses reminded me of what you've shared about your mother's knowledge. The thoughtful gesture, finding a book that connected specifically to her interests and heritage, was so perfectly characteristic of Quinn's attentiveness that Vivian felt a surge of affection warm her chest. That's incredibly thoughtful. Thank you. You're welcome to borrow it as long as you like, he said, handing her the small volume. As she accepted it, Their fingers brushed briefly, sending an unmistakable current of awareness between them. Quinn didn't immediately withdraw his hand, allowing the moment of connection to linger before stepping back. "I should let you rest," he said, his voice slightly lower than usual. "It's been a long day." "Yes," Vivian agreed, though in truth she felt more awake and alive than she had in years. "Thank you again for everything, the Thanksgiving celebration, this accommodation, the book." "No thanks necessary." Quinn moved toward the door, then paused, turning back to face her. In the flickering firelight, his expression was more open, more vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "Having you here today at the celebration, made it feel like a true giving of thanks. Not just a meal, but a genuine acknowledgement of blessings." The simple sincerity of the statement, and the implied significance of her presence in his life, created a moment of profound connection between them. Vivian found herself responding with equal honesty. "It's been a long time since I felt part of something like today. Something hopeful." She took a deep breath. "Thank you for including me, Quinn. Not just in the meal, but in the life you're building here." He nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good night, Vivian. Sleep well." After he departed, Vivian stood motionless in the center of the cabin, her heart racing with the weight of their shared moments. As the flickering firelight cast shadows on the walls, she turned the well-worn journal in her hands, feeling a surge of gratitude for Quinn's thoughtful gestures. The warmth of connection thrummed in the air as she settled in for the night, contemplating the unexpected path her life was taking in Redemption Creek. The promise of new beginnings and possibilities unfolded before her, filling her with both hope and anticipation for the future.